How's everybody doing today? Welcome back to class. I have Xiaoyun checking in on Remind. Hello, Xiaoyun. Very good to see you. Hi, Andre. Good to see you too. How's everybody doing today? It's good to see you. Thanks for coming to the Thursday afternoon lecture.
It's good to see you. Thanks for coming to the Thursday afternoon.
I do that almost every lecture. I forget to turn my sound down on my phone. Sorry about that. Today's lecture won't last too long. We're just going to finish up on chapter 10, chapter 11. I've got module 10 written here. I meant chapter 11. It was module 10 last semester. It's chapter 11 this semester. Oh my goodness. Excuse me. I'm allergic to Thursday afternoon lectures. I see we got D Mills checking in as well. Good to see you. Hello. Thanks for coming to class today. Okay, we've got a couple of people here. I just received a text from Melanie Jalun, Mel G, about a half an hour ago. She won't be able to make it today. So Mel, you're going to have to be watching this on recording. So good evening to you if you're watching it tonight. Let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about I'm going to finish up the cognitive development. So we talked mostly about physical development on Tuesday. I talked about health risks, the number one killer of children at this age, issues related to alcohol use, cigarette usage, and issues around nutrition and well-being. So we talked about the physical development. I also talked about brain, neurological development. So today we're going to focus on a couple of the cognitive changes that occur during the adolescent period. Hopefully it won't take too long. We're going to talk about Piaget's formal operational stage of thinking. We're going to talk about the egocentric qualities of adolescent thinking, and actually you, Andre, out in the audience, you mentioned this in webinar, I guess it was yesterday. You talked a little bit about the imaginary audience. We're going to mention that today. And then we're going to talk about the information processing approach and how the information processing abilities of the human change during the adolescence period. So let's go ahead and get started. If no one has any questions, Andre, D, Xiaoyun, anybody? Remember, I talked to you on Tuesday. I suggested to you that adolescence is a time for mentoring. Remember? Oh, I forgot. I don't have my camera hooked up. But you remember on Tuesday, I suggested to you that the first year of life is all about nurturing and comforting. And then I suggested to you that early and middle childhood is about scaffolding and helping your child develop some of these primary abilities. And then during this age, your children's logical and their critical thinking abilities are there, and you can't really push them as much as you can suggest to them. So the adolescent period is a time of mentoring, when we're just providing children with good role models, adult role models, and we're hoping to encourage children to engage in the kinds of behaviors we want. Okay. Now, if you remember, we're talking about Jean Piaget. I suggested to you, Jean Piaget argued that our minds evolved through 4 different stages, and that these stages represent the natural epigenetic unfolding of our intellectual abilities. If you remember, I suggested to you, Piaget said in infancy, we are pre-symbolic. Then we move from a stage he called pre-operational, where we're symbolic but not logical. I then suggested to you that Piaget's third stage said we were logical, but really not great at being abstract or critical thinkers. Well, in stage 4, Piaget argued that human beings' mind evolves into a 4th type of ability. He called this the formal operational stage, and this is where we can think logically and abstractly. So we can begin to we can begin to answer hypothetical questions much better than we could in our early or middle childhood. We're going to have increased ability to talk our way through problems. And we're going to begin to think about the quality of our thinking, right? So I'm going to be able to evaluate how well I'm thinking about an object. And you're going to notice that kids during this age are going to get very idealistic, and they're going to think about possibilities and perfection and how their life experience doesn't meet whatever idealistic expectations we might have for how things go. And one of the things that you'll hear from kids this age is that's not fair, that's not right. Kids are definitely into what's right and wrong at this period. They're good debaters. That's what you're going to find when you have teenagers, that they're going to be like little lawyers, questioning your motives and having you explain why you're doing things. Now, the one term that Piaget used to describe this term, to characterize this term, was the term hypothetical deductive reasoning. And he argued that children during this age are able to create a hypothesis and deduce its implications. So that is, your child's going to be able to figure out that this would be a bad idea even before they do it, right? And Piaget suggested that not everybody exhibits this full formal operational thinking. He argued that a lot of people don't make it into fully formal operational thinking. Now, they may be able to think critically about something they do every day. So most people can think critically about their job. That's because it's familiar and you do it every day. But he argued that true critical thinking, true formal operational thinking, was your ability to respond critically and logically to new situations. And he argued not everybody exhibits this full formal operational thinking. Now, if you remember, there are some critiques of Piaget. He seemed to think that we all sort of went through this same systematic process in the same way at the same time. And there's much more individual variation than Piaget ever envisioned. So he has this very static model of how our brain changes, and he sort of doesn't quite have the flexibility to incorporate the individual variation that we will see in the human population. Remember, I suggested to you that Piaget was not as much interested in the social environment, and that would include things like culture, educational systems, and he argued that it was sort of this internal development, this biological development that was happening, and he really discounted the importance of culture and education. Remember, we're going to suggest that culture and education and the social situation is sort of the important part of the cognitive development process. Remember, I think we all suggested that Vygotsky's social model, his scaffolding model, probably is a better way of representing how we learn. Now, and most developmentalists are not going to be quite as impressed by his very rigid 4-stage model. And so developmental psychologists don't really talk about these 4 unique stages. Instead, we tend to focus on the individual abilities and each of their individual abilities' trajectories as they develop. So we're not necessarily suggesting that you go through this stage. Instead, we're going to focus on your individual abilities and track their development over your childhood. Now, your book talks about the work by a fellow named David Elkin. He's a developmental writer, and he focused. He's got a book called The Wonder of Boys, and he's got a great outlook on the developmental needs of children as they grow up. And he was very interested in the way in which teenagers seem to think a little bit differently than adults. Now, each and every one of us is very interested in how we present ourselves to the world. We all, in impression management is a very important research area in social psychology. So every last one of us knows that people are watching us and that we have to present ourselves a certain way to the people in our environment. But for teenagers, this appears to be a little bit heightened. They tend to think that more people are paying attention to them than really are. And so what you're going to see is that these teenagers they're gonna think logically and abstractly, but they're still going to be a little bit self-centered and egocentric in their thinking. And so he talked about these two things: imaginary audience and personal fable. And one of the things that you're going to notice with your children is that they are going to have this belief that everybody in the world is watching everything they do. So you go out with your kids in public and you want to hug them or put your hand on them or pat them on the back, they will stop you. They'll be so embarrassed. Oh my God, people are going to notice. People are going to notice. Dad, quit doing that. You're embarrassing me so much. And it's because at this age, children seem to think that everybody is focusing their attention in on the one child. And your book talks a little bit about social networking. And you know that the weird thing is with social media, you can set up a situation where everybody does focus on you. And you can become pretty narcissistic about it if you spend your time thinking about the likes and the loves and the comments that you get from the things that you post online. So in a sense, social media has created this world where we can put ourselves out there to this imaginary audience. Your book talks about the link between social networking and narcissism. I have a colleague of mine from graduate school who's a world-renowned expert on narcissism, and Dr. Campbell talks an awful lot about the link between social media and the rising rates of narcissism that we see in millennial kids these days. Okay, now the second sort of characteristic of adolescent thinking that you're going to see is this thing called a personal fable. Each kid thinks that they're unique, they're special, that nothing ever could happen to me because I'm sort of the most unique human being in the world. And when you try to explain to your kids that you were there and that you have some experience that you can give to your children, you're going to find that your children are going to resist your advice that you've learned as a function of growing up and being in their shoes, because your kid is going to be quite certain that nobody's heart has ever been broken like their heart has been broken. Nobody's ever been as sad as they've been. Nobody's ever had the kind of trouble and depression that your kid has. So each and every kid's going to feel like their experience is so unique that nobody ever could have experienced this. But you know what? We all experienced rejection in high school. We all experienced love and embarrassment and all of these emotions in high school. But your high school kid is not going to understand that yet. So they're going to have this bizarre belief that somehow or another nobody can understand what they're going through. And David Elkin argues that sometimes this leads children to do dangerous and risky things and hurt themselves because they feel so unique and special and invulnerable. And so that's sort of this idea of the personal fable. Now, research they surveyed kids about the likelihood of their dying in the next year and found that most kids, though, however, do tend to overestimate their chance of dying compared to the actual base rates of it happening. Okay, so these are sort of the two styles of thinking that you're going to see in your adolescent children. Okay, now, remember every time we talk about Piaget and the old school developmental approach, I then remind you of the information processing approach. These are, you might call these people neo-Piagetians, cognitive developmental psychologists, but these are the people that study the model from the belief, again, that it's an information processing system, and they're interested in how our information processing abilities change as we develop. And what you're going to find during this age is that kids' executive functioning is really coming online, and they're getting to be more like adult thinkers like you. Now, if to remind you, executive functioning is sort of those higher level cognitive processes that organizes and guide our cognition. So we have memory. Think of that as a low-level process, but your ability to know how to remember things, your meta-memory, is sort of a high-level executive processing. Your short-term memory is sort of a basic cognitive process, but your ability in how to use and maximize your short-term memory is an executive process. So think of executive functioning as sort of these high-level cognitive processes that allow you to direct your thinking in more effective and efficient manners. And if you remember, I suggested to you this is tied to the prefrontal cortex and develops last in humans. Now, your book suggests, looks at 3 different components of higher level executive functioning. They look at cognitive control, decision making, and critical thinking. All right. Now, unlike the basic memory skills like using your short-term memory or being able to remember things, cognitive developmental psychologists described in your textbook are going to argue that there's great variation in adult executive functioning. So while there's less variation in our low-level cognitive functionings, our memory, maybe our short-term memory, developmental psychologists suggest that there may be great variability in how good your executive functioning is. And you folks know this. Some of your compadres in school are good at studying and good at getting good grades, and others are not quite so good at sitting there paying attention, getting good grades, and doing those kinds of things. And so this would actually, so if you want to translate this idea that basic universal cognitive skills are all children attain, there's great variation, and adolescents are producers of their own development to a greater extent than our children. So I'd like to reinterpret that or translate that for you. Basically, what that statement says is not everybody develops great thinking abilities. And really, it is up to you as to how good you get at being a good thinker. It's something you have to practice. It's something that you have to care about and you have to develop. You have to spend time thinking critically. You have to focus on important issues and sort them out in your mind. You have to focus on your attention. You, in a sense, have to want to develop these abilities. And I believe that college is very important at helping us learn and develop these executive functioning skills. By coming to class and listening to the lecture, you're learning how to control your attention. By talking about issues and sorting out whether or not you believe we should engage in gender role socialization or not, you are developing your critical thinking abilities. To the degree that you develop these executive functions that make you a really great thinker, you have to want to work on them and you have to focus on them. And you know what, if you think about it, the modern cognitive developmental psychologists in saying not everybody develops great executive functioning skills is kind of similar to the way Piaget viewed it by suggesting that not everybody reaches formal operational thinking. I think the similarity between Piaget and between these modern cognitive developmental psychologists is that they suggest that the top ends of human cognitive functioning aren't universally given or developed in all of us. And you folks have been around long enough and have met some of your adult friends to know that some of your friends think better than some of your other friends. In fact, every time I log into Facebook and see some of my adult friends, I realize that some of them are thinking well and some of them are not thinking well at all. And your book talks about 3 components of this higher level executive functioning: cognitive control, decision making, and critical thinking. So, cognitive control is the ability to control your attention, to reduce interfering thoughts, and demonstrate cognitive flexibility. So really, cognitive control is your ability to focus and move your mind the way you want it to. And what I've noticed is that some of my students are not very good at focusing on a lecture. In fact, we're 20 minutes into a lecture and I've already lost 2 of you off of the lecture. So a couple of you weren't able to focus quite as long as the other students were. Focus, focus, focus is a very important executive skill. Your book then talks about decision making, which is the ability to evaluate a problem, a set of premises, and select from a set of optional responses the correct response to maximize your benefits, your ability to make a good decision. And again, not everybody is necessarily great at this. Your book talks about this thing called the dual process model as a reason, as a way of explaining why sometimes teenagers don't make as good a choice as the rest of us. And they have this thing called the dual process model. So they argue that decision making is guided by sort of two types of thinking. Analytical thinking, which is where you think specifically about the problem, the situations for that problem, the exact behaviors that you could do in that exact situation, and you think about the problem in very literal, specific terms. That's sort of analytical thinking. But they argue another type of processing that we do when we're engaging in thinking about decisions is we use gist thinking, which is a little bit fuzzier, where we think about the problem in general, abstract, bottom line functionings, general principles, if you will. And what they argue is that sometimes a lot of teenagers get caught up in analytical thinking, thinking about this specific situation, and don't focus on the general abstract principles that would guide their decision making to better decisions. So I'm talking about, I'm here at this party, I have a bunch of people around. The idea is, do I want to engage in some sort of risky behavior, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana? What they're arguing is that the kids are going to think about this in terms of specific details regarding this situation and aren't going to remember the general principles of healthy living and smart decision making that their parents give them. And so they're going to be more likely to make bad decisions in these situations. So your book suggests that they provided an intervention to these kids where they trained to focus on gist thinking as well as analytical thinking, and they found that these adolescents showed reduced risk taking 1 year later, suggesting that maybe kids tend to get focused on the details, the situation, the here and now, and don't think about general principles quite as well. Now, the final aspect of this executive functioning that your book talks about is critical thinking, which is the ability to apply knowledge and solve problems effectively in an unfamiliar situation, using what you learned in situation A to apply it to new situation B to come up with a good decision. And what you're going to find is that sort of this flexible critical thinking is actually the part of intellectual functioning that begins to decline in later adulthood. You're going to know the facts you know, and your factual crystallized knowledge is not going to change as you get older. But your ability to think flexibly is going to decline in your 50s and 60s. And the reason in studying that, the factors that we think underlie critical thinking abilities are the speed and automaticity of informational thinking. If you've ever been around an older person trying to click around on the internet or do something, you as a young person will tend to find that when you're watching old man Roddenberry try to solve something on the computer, you're probably going to be depressed with how slow I think and move. Actually, the speed of intellectual processing does slow down as you get older. But we think that this is a part of critical thinking. And you know what? Children at this age are also, you got to know a lot of things if you're going to apply this new situation to old situations. You have to have a bunch of old situations to base your knowledge on. So the breadth and content of knowledge is going to expand, which is going to lead to the critical thinking abilities in this age. Right? And your kids are going to be able to take these new knowledge structures and those old knowledge structures, and they're going to create new combination of knowledge. And your kids are going to, as you solve things, they're going to learn strategies that will help them in new situations. So critical thinking is sort of flexibility of thinking. And it depends on how fast your brain works, how much knowledge you have, your ability to combine your knowledge forms together, and your ability to apply these old knowledge structures in new situations. And so what you're going to see during the teenage years is kids' ability to focus, their ability to come to decisions, and their ability to think flexibly is going to sort of blossom. And this is going to be the culmination of our intellectual functioning. Now remember, as I suggested a couple of slides ago, most cognitive developmental psychologists, most Piagetians would say that there's great flexibility in people's ability to engage in these sort of cognitive processes. Now, I do want to follow up one note. This is not necessarily going to be on your exam, but I did want to point you in a direction. So in Tuesday's lecture, I talked about all of these risky behaviors as like drinking, drug taking, teenage sex. A lot of these risky behaviors in teens, people who watch these risky behaviors have noticed that there's been a significant downturn in the number of risky behaviors that kids engage in. They're less likely to smoke in the teenage years, less likely to drink, less likely to take drugs, less likely to engage in teenage sex. And on one hand, you might say, wow, what a great thing. These are all risky behaviors that we don't want children to engage in. But there are some people who believe that sometimes these risky behaviors allow kids to begin to develop their critical thinking and decision-making behaviors. So going to that party and being offered that alcohol gives you a chance to learn some decision-making skills. Engaging in these sort of adult-like behaviors are ways in which we practice for being adults. And I'm going to talk about a lady named Jen Twenge. She is actually an expert in this field, and she's been studying this sort of demographic change, this cohort change in adolescence. And what she suggests is that if you look at these risky behaviors, the amount of time that kids spend away from parents and their attempt and desire to engage in milestone events like getting a license and whatnot, what you're going to notice is that today's 18-year-olds actually look like 14-year-olds from the 1990s in terms of their desire to do risky behaviors, the time they spend away from their parents, and their interest in getting these milestones. And she actually thinks that that these risky behaviors and this development has been slowed by the introduction of the smartphone. She can point to 2003, the introduction of the smartphone, as being sort of a watershed event when you can see sort of these numbers changing. And she argues that the phone and the fact that it's changed the way we live is actually not a very good thing. Now, while not smoking and taking drugs as a 14 or 15-year-old is a good thing, the lack of development and interest in the external world caused by the phone is actually leading to developmental delays, which means kids are becoming young adults without being prepared for the pressures of being an adult. And what she notices is that starting in 2003, you're going to see that depression, anxiety is starting to spike in teenage kids. And she argues that really it's important for us to focus on the impact that cell phones and smartphones are having on our development. And I would highly suggest that you folks should take a look at some of her books in order to sort of get an appreciation. If you find this topic interesting, I would suggest that you take a look at any one of her 3 books. She calls this newest cohort the iGen, or Generation Me, and so she's got a couple of books there. And then she co-authored a book with Keith Campbell, the narcissism expert. And I will put in a personal plug here. Keith Campbell was my office mate in graduate school for the first 2 years I was there. and I spent some time talking with him. He's an incredibly interesting fellow, and he's got some really good YouTube videos. If any of you are interested in narcissism, send me a text, and I'll be more than happy to share those cool videos of Keith Campbell with you. Oh, by the way, in your course resources folder, I do have a TED Talk by Dr. Twenge, where she talks about this particular phenomenon, and I highly recommend you take 15 minutes out of your day and watch that video. Okay, you know what? Sort of a short lecture today. That's all I had to share with you. Does anybody have any questions for me? Please, if you would, send me a text. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. That's all I had to share today. I'm going to stay on the chat bar for a couple of minutes answering questions if anybody has them. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and log off for the day. Don't forget to do your discussion board that's due tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. And I do look forward to seeing you next Tuesday in class.